Hello and welcome to AmericanNavalHistory.com. My name is John Sorensen and I am recording a series of lessons to teach the history of the United States Navy. Our Navy has played a very important role in the history of our country, and without it, our nation and our world would be very different. In this lesson, we will cover the beginning of the Revolutionary War, the initial organization of the Continental Army, and the appointment of George Washington as the Commander-in-Chief. Due to technical constraints, the formation of the Continental Navy and the ending of the Siege of Boston will have to wait until the next lesson. But this lesson does set the stage and explain the need for the Continental Navy. So topics covered in this lesson will be very important to the understanding of why the colonists decided that they needed to build a navy. Before I start talking about the opening battles of the war, it is very important to look at and understand the geography of Boston and the surrounding area as they were in 1775. When you look at the map on the left, Boston is the main island in the middle with a narrow neck of land with a land bridge on its south side connecting it to the mainland. This is called the neck of Boston. The neck flooded with the high tide and was often too muddy to cross. To the right of the neck is Dorkshire Heights. This is a high ground that overlooks the city. On the west side of Boston is Cambridge. To the north of Boston is another island with a thin neck. That is Charlestown, Bunker Hill, and Breed's Hill. Also not shown on the map are several islands that were used for grazing cattle and sheep. The map to the right is an overlay of 1775 Boston on top of modern-day Boston. You can see that the city has been built up and no longer is connected to the mainland by a thin neck. In the beginning of 1775, there were 6,000 British soldiers and troops in Boston. Boston was an occupied city. The Massachusetts militia began to stockpile weapons and ammunition and other supplies in a town called Concord, 20 miles away. This is also where John Hancock and Samuel Adams were hiding out. They were pretty much free to wander around the countryside, but they were wanted men in Boston where the British had control. The British were pretty much confined to Boston and had very little authority outside the city. Dr. Benjamin Church was a trusted patriot and a member of the Massachusetts Safety Committee, which planned many of the rebellious actions. Dr. Church provided information to the British about the rebel stockpile in Concord, Massachusetts. Apparently, he had a very high-priced girlfriend and needed more cash to keep her happy. So he sold the information to the British. When Paul Revere and William Dawes found out about the British plan to go out to Concord to capture the militia supplies, and they were also going out to capture John Hancock and Samuel Adams, Revere and Dawes set out to warn the countryside to alert the militia to get John Hancock and Samuel Adams alerted that the British were coming after them. So they had to row a boat across the Boston Harbor where all the British naval vessels were. But the lack of communication between the British Army and the British Navy kind of did not alert the Navy that there was an operation going on and to keep the harbor clear of boats. So Paul Revere and William Dawes were able to get out of Boston to the mainland and get on their horses for their famous ride. The British are coming, the British are coming. They woke up John Hancock and Samuel Adams out of their sleep, who were able to get away just in time. A small group of militiamen were able to meet up with the British on their way to Concord in a small town called Lexington. There was a short battle at Lexington in which 8 militiamen were killed. After the battle, the British continued on to Concord to capture the supplies. When the British got to Concord, most of the militia supplies had been removed and hidden, and the soldiers were led to smaller depots that were set up there as decoys. The trouble for the British didn't come until they left Concord for the 20-mile march back to Boston. The road back to Boston was lined with patriots. They were behind every fence, wall, tree, or house along the way, along the whole road back. They're taking pot shots at the troops as they march back to Boston. Maurice Matloff's book says that the militia troops fired 75,000 shots at the British, who rarely saw where the shots were coming from. The British troops were absolutely terrified every step of the way, and that was a 20-mile walk. They were terrified for 20 miles all the way back to Boston. They were reinforced along the way back that brought their strength up to about 1,800 troops, but by the time they got back to Boston, 273 British soldiers were dead. When they got back to Boston, the city was surrounded by 16,000 colonial militiamen and volunteers. A siege was set up around the city of Boston, and the British became trapped inside the city, and that siege would last for 11 months. Immediately after the battles of Lexington and Concord, Eldridge Gerry investigated exactly what happened. Now, Eldridge Gerry, he became very important during the Constitutional Convention when they actually wrote the Constitution. But at this point, what he did, after this battle, was he investigated and wrote a full report of everything that had happened. He interviewed witnesses, he interviewed militiamen. He wrote a detailed and accurate report that reflected the colonist side of the battles of Lexington and Concord. Gerry interviewed many witnesses for his report. Basically, his report was about British troops leaving their garrison to attack a bunch of poor farmers that were defenseless. Gerry gave his report to a friend of his named John Darby. Darby sailed a real fast schooner called the Quiero over to England with the news of the Battle of Lexington and Concord. The Patriot version of Gerry's writings, Gerry's report, his side of the story was printed in all the British newspapers and all the newspapers all over Europe a whole week before the British Army's official report arrived to London. Gerry's report was so accurate that all of the facts contained in the Army's report served to confirm that the Patriot side of the story was right. About 3 weeks after the Battle of Lexington and Concord on May 10, 1775, Ethan Allen, Benedict Arnold, and 83 what they call their Green Mountain Boys captured Fort Ticonderoga. The next day they captured Fort Crown Point, and within a week conducted several other raids capturing British supplies, cannons, and ships, and more importantly, control of the Hudson River and Lake Champlain waterways. Control of Lake Champlain and Fort Ticonderoga prevented the British from isolating New England from the rest of the colonies. Look at the map here. The Hudson River separates New England from the rest of the colonies. Massachusetts, Rhode Island, and other New England colonies are to the east of the river, and the rest of the colonies are to the west of it. The British wanted to isolate the war against New England. Control of the river would cut off New England from communication and supplies. The British wanted to control the river and isolate the troublesome colonies from the rest of the peaceful central and southern colonies. They wanted to quarantine the rebellion in a small isolated part of America. Now, another important aspect of this battle was that the Continental Congress still wanted to make peace with Great Britain before all-out war started after the Battle of Lexington and Concord. Since most of the British population, had read and understood and believed, actually, that Eldridge Gerry's version of the British attacking poor defenseless farmers, peace was still very possible. The British population was not eager to go to war, and they were blaming a lot of Lexington and Concord on their own army. But now the Continental forces, the colonial forces, had actually attacked a couple of British forts, and Congress knew that that was going to be unforgivable, and that they knew now war was unavoidable. Okay, the next thing we need to talk about is a battle that they call the Battle of Bunker Hill. The island of Charlestown is to the north of Boston, and just like Boston, it too is connected to the mainland by a narrow neck of a land bridge. Bunker Hill is up on the north part of the island near the neck. In late May 1775, more British troops arrived in Boston, bringing the total troop strength to about 10,000 British soldiers. The British decided to move out and to take the high ground that surrounded and overlooking the city. That was for a military strategic reasons to take the high ground away from the colonists that could use it against them. On the evening of June 16th, a group of colonists was sent to Bunker Hill to dig in and fortify the positions overlooking the British positions that were in Boston. But when they got there, they decided to dig in and fortify Breed's Hill instead of Bunker Hill up near the neck. They thought that Breed's Hill would give them a better, closer vantage point to the British in Boston, but they did not consider that it would eliminate their escape route if they ever needed to try to retreat. And need to escape, they sure did. They spent the entire night of June 16th digging in and fortifying Breed's Hill. They spent the whole night digging trenches. So when the morning came, they were really tired. And that's when the British decided to start bombarding the hill. The bombardment came from the British Navy, and it lasted all morning long. Shortly after noon, the British troops decided to charge the entrenched Americans with a full frontal charge. The Americans successfully beat back the British attackers. Later in the afternoon, the British made a second charge. This second charge was also unsuccessful. Later in the afternoon, the British received more reinforcements and attempted a third charge. But very shortly after the third charge commenced, the colonial defenders actually ran out of ammunition. The British overran the trenches with their bayonets, and the colonists did not have any bayonets, and they did not have an escape path either. By the time it was all over, the British had lost 1,054 soldiers, and the Americans lost about 440 men. But the British held the high ground. It was a victory for the British, but it was a very costly victory for them. So now at this point, in May and June of 1775, there were 10,000 British troops trapped inside the city of Boston, and they were surrounded by angry colonists who had control of the rest of the New England countryside. That is going to pretty much set the pattern for the rest of the war. The British will be able to take control of the cities, but never had nearly enough men to control the spread out countryside where most of the American people actually lived. That theme will remain true throughout most of the war. The Americans, being as independent as they were able to survive without the use of the occupied cities. Their food did not come from the occupied cities, nor did it continue to go there. Here's another very important aspect of the situation. The colonies did not have any manufacturing industries at all. The British had always bought raw materials from the colonies to feed their manufacturing industries back home in England. So they never allowed manufacturing facilities to be built in America because they would actually compete with the ones back home. So America had no factories to make guns, ammunition, tools, or even the material to make clothing. Colonial women had to actually hand spin the wool to make the threads and the yarns for the soldiers' clothing. The British had called the American troops homespun. Nobody in the colonies knew how to make gunpowder and cannons. Later, some French did arrive to teach these technologies to the colonists, but that was a year or two later. It frustrated the colonists that they could see the British ships come and go at will to resupply the troops in Boston, and there was nothing that they could do about it. Now, these British resupply ships coming to Boston were great at bringing guns, ammunition, and other goods, but it was a 3 to 4 week journey from Great Britain, so most of the food that they brought was stale and heavily salted meat. Remember, when they did not have any refrigerated cargo ships in 1775, so the British troops were not eating very well. So the colonists surrounding the city had great food, but few guns and ammo. And the British inside the city had plenty of weapons, but they had very little food or firewood. It was June 14th, 1775 that the Continental Congress voted to adopt the 4 colonial militias that were conducting the siege around Boston. It was only the militias from the New England area that were surrounding Boston, and they were not united. Each of the state militias had a different commander. Now, these 4 commanders, they did kind of fall into an informal agreement to allow the Massachusetts commander, his name was Artemus Ward, to be their commander. But they were really 4 different military units. They were not one until Congress adopted all of them into a united army. And Congress also voted to raise up 10 rifle companies from outside of New England area, from the other colonies, to make this a much wider group, not just a group of New Englanders. This would draw the other colonies into the war, so that Britain was fighting against a larger United Colonies army and not just New England force. On June 14, 1775, is still celebrated as the official birthday of the United States Army. The next day, on June 15th, Congress appointed George Washington as the commander-in-chief. Although George Washington did not ask for the job, he kind of hinted that he wanted it, because he wore his militia uniform to the Continental Congress every day and kind of reminding everybody, hey, I am a military man. But why did they pick George Washington? There were several other men that had more military experience than he did, and Artemus Ward was already on the scene running things. So why did they pick Washington? See, Washington was a Southerner. The war so far was just a local skirmish up in New England. Congress wanted support from all the colonies. Southerners did not seem to be too very interested in the trouble that was occurring up in Rhode Island and Massachusetts. They were happy selling their crops to the British. They were farmers. But Congress wanted to make this war a united colonies effort, not just a local New England rebellion. So they chose George Washington as commander-in-chief, partly because he was from the South and from Virginia, which was the biggest and the richest of all the colonies. So the Congress wanted widespread support from all the colonies. So they drafted troops from all the colonies from the South, and they chose a leader from the South, and that erased a lot of the regional, hey, this is their problem, not ours. But no, George Washington's there, hey, we're there too. So after being appointed commander-in-chief, George Washington left Philadelphia and actually arrived in Cambridge, Massachusetts on July 2nd and formally took command on July 4th, 1775. When he arrived in Cambridge, Washington immediately noticed several problems that he had to deal with immediately. There were huge cultural differences between the militiamen from the different colonies. The southern colonies were much more rank, conscious, and formal than the northern colonies were. The northern militias made group decisions among the men, and decisions in the southern militia were made by the officers and given to the enlisted men as orders. Washington had to change the level culture. They call this a level culture, and he had to change that into a military structure. This meant that a lot of discipline had to be enforced. Alcohol was a problem. The men were coming and going as they pleased. They were not showing up for roll call. Officers had no control of the troops. Ammunition and gunpowder supplies were running very, very low, and there did not seem to be any method of resupply available. All this was going on while they were trying to hold the world's biggest army under siege. Under Washington's command, court-martials and lashings were common. Washington stressed personal integrity and reliability to all of his men and officers. He strongly encouraged everybody to attend divine services. Discipline and gunpowder were his biggest problems. He attempted to capture a British supply of gunpowder in Bermuda, but that attempt failed. The British were constantly being resupplied by ships, but there was absolutely nothing George Washington could do about it except for to watch it happen. Okay, that's where I need to tie it off for now. The need to intercept British shipping was obvious to George Washington and to the Congress. This would deprive the British of their supplies, and it would provide valuable, needed supplies to the colonists. It was obvious to everybody that a navy was vital to the success of the colonists. That's where I want to tie it off for now. In the next lesson, we'll see how George Washington solves the supply problems by forming a secret navy to capture the British supply ships at sea. They capture guns and ammunition, and Congress will also appropriate funding for the first ships of the Continental Navy. So let's go ahead and tie it off now, and we'll do all that in the next lesson. My name is John Sorensen, and thank you for listening to AmericanNavalHistory.com.